What follows is the subject of constitutional interpretation as it relates to the Constitution of the United States of America. Much of this information is taken from the website covering the subject that is linked in the below bar. At the end of this is a pop quiz. I'll begin by reading a section of the website in question. The Constitution is short. It cannot, and does not, attempt to cover every eventuality. Even when it seems clear, there can be conflicting rights, conflicting spheres of power. When disputes arise, it comes time for the people, and most importantly, judges of the judicial branch, to interpret the Constitution. The concept of constitutional interpretation is foreign in some countries, where the Constitution makes a reasonable effort to cover every eventuality. These constitutions are generally rigid and little changing, adapting slowly to advances in political views, popular opinion, technology, and changes in government. The US Constitution, however, has been termed a living constitution, in part because it grows and adapts to internal and external pressures, changing from one era and generation to the next. When a new situation arises, or even a new variation on an old situation, the Constitution is often looked at for guidance. It is at this point that the various interpretations of the Constitution come into play. There is no one right way to interpret the Constitution, and people often do not always stick to one interpretation. Below then are the major diversions in interpretation. Your own personal beliefs may fall into several of these categories. Originalists think that the best way to interpret the Constitution is to determine how the framers intended the Constitution to be interpreted. They look to the various sources to determine this intent, including the contemporary writings of the framers, newspaper articles, the Federalist Papers, and the notes from the Constitutional Convention itself. Originalists consider the original intent to be the most pure way of interpreting the Constitution. The opinions of the framers were, for the most part, well documented. If there is an unclear turn of phrase in the Constitution, who better to explain it than those who wrote it? Opponents of originalism note several points. First, the Constitution may have been the product of the framers, but it was ratified by hundreds of delegates in 13 state conventions. Should not the opinions of these people hold even more weight? Also, the framers were a diverse group, and many had issues with specific parts of the Constitution. Whose opinions should be used? Next, do the opinions of a small, homogeneous group from 200 years ago have the respect of the huge, diverse population of today? To a black woman, how much trust can be placed in the thoughts of a white slave owner who's been dead for generations? In truth, as with all of the following interpretations, most people use originalism when it suits them. Finding a quote from a framer to support a modern position can be a powerful way to advance your point of view. Those who most oppose the originalist approach often consider themselves to be modernists or instrumentalists. A modernist approach to constitutional interpretation looks at the Constitution as if it were ratified today. What meaning would it have today if written today? How does modern life affect the words of the Constitution? The main argument against originalism is that the Constitution becomes stale and irrelevant to modern life if only viewed through 18th century eyes. Additionally, we have more than 200 years of history and legal precedent to look back on, and that we are modern individuals with as much difficulty in reasonably thinking like 18th century men as those 18th century men would have had trouble thinking like us. Modernists also contend that the Constitution is deliberately vague in many areas, expressly to permit modern interpretations to override older ones as the Constitution ages. It is this interpretation that best embodies the living Constitution concept. The Constitution is flexible and dynamic, changing slowly over time as the morals and beliefs of the population shift. Modernists do not reject originalism. They recognize that there is value in a historical perspective, but the contemporary needs of society outweigh an adherence to a potentially dangerously outdated angle of attack. Originalists feel that modernism does a disservice to the Constitution, that the people who wrote it had a pure and valid vision for the nation, and that their vision should be able to sustain us through any constitutional question. Historical literalists believe that the contemporary writings of the framers are not relevant to any interpretation of the Constitution. The only thing one needs to interpret the Constitution is a literal reading of the words contained therein, with an expert knowledge in 18th century meaning of those words. The debates leading to the final draft are not relevant. The Federalist Papers are not relevant, only the words. The historical literalist takes a similar look at the Constitution as an originalist does, but the literalist has no interest in expanding beyond the text for answers to questions. For example, a historical literalist will see the militia of the Second Amendment as referring to an all able-bodied men from 17 to 45. just as in the 18th century, and this interpretation will colour that person's reading of the Second Amendment. Very similar to an historical literalist, a contemporary literalist looks only to the words of the Constitution for guidance, but this literalist has no interest in historical meaning of the words. The contemporary literalist looks to modern dictionaries to determine the meaning of the words with the Constitution, ignoring precedent and legal dissertation and relying solely on the definition of the words. Just as the historical literalist views parallels the original views, but much more narrow in focus, so too does the contemporary literalist mirror the modernist. And again, the main difference is the literalist looks only to the words of the Constitution for meaning. To expand on the Second Amendment example, the contemporary literalist will view the militia as the modern National Guard, and this will colour that person's view of the Second Amendment. Finally, the democratic interpretation is the last approach to interpretation. Democratic interpretation is also known as normative or representation reinforcement. Democratic proponents advocate that the Constitution is not designed to be a set of specific principles and guidelines, but that it was designed to be a general principle, a basic skeleton on which contemporary vision would be built upon. Decision as to the meaning of the Constitution must look at the general feeling invoked by the Constitution and then use modern realism to pad out the skeleton. As evidence, Democrats point out that many phrases, such as due process and equal protection, are deliberately vague, that the phrases are not defined in context. The guidance for interpretation must come from that basic framework that the framers provided, but that to fill in the gaps, modern society's current morals and feelings must be taken into consideration. Changes in the Constitution that stem from this kind of philosophy will end up with the principles of the population at large, while ensuring that the framers still have a say in the underlying decision of ruling. This interpretation is seen to enhance democratic ideals and the notion of republicanism. So these are the interpretations of the Constitution. My personal opinion is that each of these constitutional interpretations are seen as perfectly valid to those people who hold it. My previous video on the subject of the Constitution received several comments from a certain user who is under the impression that his interpretation of the Constitution, namely that of original intent, is the only acceptable one, and that anyone who holds a different interpretation, be they a layman or a Supreme Court judge, is completely and utterly wrong. These comments are available to view in the below bar. So with this being the case, here's the pop quiz. Question 1, multiple choice. Someone who holds one view of the Constitution and refuses to acknowledge that any of the others has any validity whatsoever is A. Arrogant, or B. Open-minded. Question 2. Someone who uses the analogy of a piece of paper with a grocery list of items for you to pick up in order to make their point that the Constitution is the only correct interpretation in the way that he tells you it should be interpreted is A. Making a sound and reasonable argument, or B. Making a specious analogy. Question 3. Someone who calls you a self-righteous asshat for pointing out the arrogance of insisting that he is right and that anyone who disagrees with him is wrong is A. Closed-minded and supremely arrogant, or B. Being completely reasonable and making a sound argument. Question 4. True or false? Someone who tells you that he is right and the Supreme Court justices are wrong in using more than one constitutional interpretation in one sentence, and then telling you that he is doing precisely what the Supreme Court justices do in their constitutional interpretation in the next sentence, is being consistent. Question 5. True or false? Pointing out that someone is a lying sack of shit means that you absolutely must hate them. Question 6. People who follow philosophies of objectivism, specifically those of Ayn Rand, are unequivocally and unquestioningly anarchists no matter what they tell you. True or false? And question 7. Fill in the blank. Someone who tells you in the same sentence that the Constitution is not vague and any attempt to claim that it is can easily be defeated, and then in the same sentence makes appeals to external documentation that was needed to clarify sections of the Constitution that can be given different meanings, is what? Now, the individual in question did receive a timeout for demonstrating a shocking and supreme arrogance in his comments, which again are in the info bar. I also have preserved screenshots of all of them in case he starts to get happy with the remove button on his posts. He's since had his posting privileges restored, for the time being, depending on whether he can stop behaving like an infant. And that's enough political bullshit for one day, thank you very much.